The soil, after the bodies had rotted and the winter rains had fallen, was so fertilized with the putrefied matter which sank into it that in the following season it yielded an unprecedented crop. Plutarch, in the battle of Aquae Sextiae, in which Caius Marius and his army destroyed the barbarian invaders of Italy. No matter what political perspective you maintain today, you may feel a little disappointed now as you hear about the decline of Rome accelerating. Yes, perhaps you feel that the land reform was justified, and that the laws passed by the Gracchi brothers, which benefited the plebs, the commoners of Rome, were also just and forward thinking, and so on. And hopefully, no matter what your political stance, you are horrified by the murder of those two revolutionary brothers, by the images of the thousands of dead being pushed into the river Tiber, by the ferociousness of a reactionary Senate. But at the same time, to see the machine of Roman politics break down, even if you thought it was at heart a machine of oppression, to see it all break down is rather upsetting. To watch as the years now pass into the final century before Christ, how the fabric of Roman society begins to unravel. Once upon a time, the Roman Senate was the very paragon of stability. The consuls elected two by two, year after year, the legions formed and sent out and brought back again and again. Tenacious, indomitable Rome, expanding with every battlefield victory, turning every setback into opportunity. Her slow but steady transformation from backwater republic to Mediterranean superpower. And now what? Shady politics, decadent landlords who surround themselves with slave labor, who derive their wealth from conniving at trade rather than working the land or raising cattle as their fathers had done for centuries before them. The senators of just a century ago had bravely gone forth to war against Carthage. Most of them were cut down in battle, and their seats in that supreme legislature were taken up by their heirs, who also went forth to risk their necks alongside the other classes of Rome. And the people, that sturdy breed whom Will Durant characterized as bold, brave, and beautiful, their land had been taken. It was now worked by imported slaves, and the plebs of Rome were packed into the cities, a landless, hopeless rabble, living on the corn dole, on the free or cheap grain provided to them to keep them pacified, as the elite replaced them with imported labor. If this rings a bell, it may be that you are reminded of the West today, of cheap processed carbs and high fructose corn syrup used to keep the populace politically comatose, of high land prices blocking young generations out of ownership, and the price of labor kept so low that no worker may think beyond how to pay his bills, how to survive the next month, or even the next week. Inevitably, when such injustice begins to mount, there are reactions, and there are political challenges. First, these challenges are often headed by members of the aristocracy, as happened in Rome with the Gracchi brothers. But eventually, leadership in these matters usually passes into the hands of the plebs, into the hands of those on the receiving end of all these years and decades of injustice. With the Gracchi brothers' corpses now floated out to sea, a truly new man, a different kind of novus homo, took the helm of the revolution in Rome. His name was Caius Marius. But before we learn about this central figure in the history of the late Roman Republic, let me remind you to check out my website at western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org, where you can find all the episodes of all my podcast series. I don't just speak about Roman history in this podcast, but rather about all Western history, starting all the way back at the beginning of the universe and coming up through the Bible and Greece and Rome and the Middle Ages and covering everything all the way down to our own time. Now, if you want to help keep me off the corn dole, you can purchase Western Traditions merchandise on my shopping page. You can also support my work directly by finding the donate button at the bottom of the homepage. Press that and it takes you to the PayPal or Patreon options. Patreon supporters get behind the scenes looks at the website, updates on the direction of the podcast, and I also post the occasional link or essay on matters historical and cultural there. There are many other ways to listen to the podcast. It's also found through Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, AntennaPod, and on my podcast host site at podbean.com, as well as other platforms. You can also find me on YouTube at the Western Traditions podcast channel, where many of the podcasts have been turned into videos. Wherever you listen, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. These are free ways to support my work and to offer up a sweet-smelling sacrifice to the algorithm. And now, let's turn to the aftermath of the death of the Gracchi brothers and the state of Roman politics at the end of the 2nd century BC. Though the Gracchi brothers were dead, their land reform laws passed, and the Senate let them stand. This might seem like a victory for the people, for the classes of men and women that had built and protected the Roman state. The Senate proceeded to disperse land to the lower classes among the citizenry, and it also allowed the corn dole to stand. Now, in a previous episode, I explained how corn here really refers to grain, to wheat, and the dole meant essentially a kind of welfare. Grain for making bread was provided free or inexpensively to the masses so that they might eat and also so that they might not make trouble. It is important in hindsight of how the Senate managed Rome to understand the political purpose of the corn dole. Today in the West, we call such public assistance welfare. The purpose of these free things, the food and other resources offered by the government, is not really to assist the poor, but rather to keep the poor quiet. The corn dole, like our own modern welfare programs, was useful to politicians because it kept the poorer classes from causing trouble. Sedated by free food, by the entertainments of the Colosseum, by sports and spectacles, the poor are unlikely to give the aristocracy a headache. Now, land reform, though, as it was passed in 121 BC, was a real threat. Were the masses to move back out into the country and start farming the land with their grubby plebeian hands, not only might they become a political threat, but they would also, perhaps more importantly, upset the ambiance of the countryside, where the aristocrats had become accustomed to living amongst themselves and their slaves and no others. So it should be no surprise to you that the wealthy sabotaged the very law about land reform that they themselves passed. They inserted a clause into the law, added language to it, just as today's politicians pass bills that are hundreds or thousands of pages in length and which no one has ever read in their entirety. They added a clause which allowed the new owners of all that land which was passed out to them to immediately sell it to any bidder, and thus the moneyed classes were able to offer paltry sums to the poor, who were for the most part quickly overwhelmed by the opportunity to hold so much gold and silver in their hands. They took the money, gave back the land to the rich, and returned to the cities, where they spent the money and went back on the dole which the Senate kept in place for just such a sequence of events. In 118 BC, only a few years after its creation, the Land Reform Commission, which the Gracchi brothers had fought so hard to establish, this commission was quietly abolished, and the masses said nothing. And, as in our own time, wealth was increasingly concentrated into the hands of the few. Cicero, in his writings a couple generations later, reports a statement by one of the Democrats of his time, to the effect that, by 104 BC, only 2,000 Romans actually even owned property anymore. Now, if you step back and look at the big picture, and you remember your Roman history well, you might already see a very critical problem that could result from this wealth concentration. The traditional Roman legions had always been manned the same way, in a way reminiscent of how the Greeks had manned their own armies. The plebeian farmers supplied the basic soldier, the heavily armed legionary, the aristocrats provided cavalry and officers, and others, non-citizens or the landless poor, might provide light troops and men in other lesser roles. But now, with land belonging to only a comparative few, who would man the army with the heavily armed legionaries that were needed to protect the large local and overseas holdings of the Roman Republic? The Senate now increasingly conscripted such soldiers from the manpower of allied or subjected states. But as Will Durant puts it in his book Caesar and Christ, these men had no stomach for fighting or no love for Rome. Desertions multiplied, discipline deteriorated, and the defense of the Republic sank to its lowest ebb. It did not take long for those peoples surrounding Rome to realize her new weakness. In 113 BC, just 5 years after the land reform was cancelled, Will Durant also tells us, two Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutons, rolled down through Germany in a frightening avalanche of covered wagons, 300,000 fighting men, with their wives and their children. These massive forces were unstoppable. They wanted those Roman resources, the land, the wealth, the cities with paved roads, sewage systems, running water, sturdy bridges, and they got them. They defeated multiple Roman armies in Gaul. At Arausio, modern-day Orange in southern France, 80,000 legionaries died in battle trying to stop this horde. And now the road into the heart of Italy was open in a way that it had not been since the time of Hannibal. The delicate, decadent aristocrats quailed. The spirits of Fabius and Marcellus and the Scipios had gone out of that race. There was, fortunately for Rome and perhaps for Western history, a reprieve at that moment. The German barbarians turned west and invaded Spain instead, but after sacking the cities of that region, they came back to Gaul and planned an invasion of Italy for 102 BC. By then, though, the inevitable had happened in Rome. The soft men of the Senate, unable to provide the masculine courage required to defend their home, they turned to a rough man, a man of no background besides his proven military acumen, and put into his hands the power to save the Senate and the people of Rome. They turned to Caius Marius. We will follow precedent and just call him Marius. Plutarch speaks of the man's background with a sort of dismissive tone. He was born of parents altogether obscure and indigent, who supported themselves by their daily labor. And here we have the key distinction, really, between wealth and poverty. A distinction which is nearly overlooked by most American commenters on class and wealth. We tend to think of wealth in America anyway in terms of quantity of money, specifically with how much money you earn. So by this metric, doctors and lawyers are usually seen as rich because their jobs come with high salaries or wages. Now I put special emphasis on a couple terms there, jobs and earn, and that is where the ancients and the actually wealthy of today would differ with us, just as Plutarch would have. Truly rich people don't have to work, not at daily labor anyway, as Plutarch puts it. They own assets that produce wealth for them. They have to manage those assets to some extent, yes, but they're not punching a clock. They're not putting in required hours. So while you might read this description of Marius and think that he came from poverty, as you see poverty, then you would be mistaken. Marius's parents may have provided quite well for him with their quote-unquote daily labor. In fact, since he was at least some sort of officer in the army before his rise to power, he certainly didn't come from a family of people who were living in the streets. Compared to you or me, Marius might have been quite well off, because the quiet secret of modern life is that most of us, as Plutarch puts it, are obscure and indigent. If you get up most days and go to work, you are, in the historical scheme of things, poor. Anyway, adding to Plutarch's somewhat disguised distaste for Marius is his ignorance of Greek, which Marius never learned. Plutarch characterizes Marius as having no patience for learning such things as foreign languages or watching Greek theater. But Plutarch does admit of the man's bravery, calling him naturally valiant and warlike. Marius is known to have served under Scipio Aemilianus, also called Africanus, but not to be confused with the Scipio Africanus of the Second Punic War. Rather, we speak here of the hero of the Third Punic War, under whom Tiberius Gracchi had served. Marius, we think, was born sometime around 155 BC, perhaps a year or two before or after that. He fought under that Scipio in Spain versus the Numidians, about whom we heard in the last episode, and later he fought in other theaters of war. Thus, while the drama of the Gracchi brothers was playing out in Rome, Marius was in the field. But he was ambitious, and perhaps seeing that greater power was found in politics, he stood for election to the office of tribune of the people, as the Gracchi had done, and he won that election to be tribune in 119 BC, just 2 years after the death of Caius Gracchus. Rough as he might have been, Marius moved more subtly than the Gracchi did. One of his first acts as tribune of the people was to support and pass a law which limited aristocratic power in the courts. However, he also later resisted the corn dole, and this made him enemies among the plebeians as well. Nevertheless, over the long term, Marius would become associated with radical politics. Now, Marius was not returned for his second year as tribune. His career in politics was much more successful than that of the Gracchis in the long run, but not as direct and not as quick. He then sought to be chosen as an aedile, a type of mid-level bureaucrat, and he failed to secure that seat as well. Finally, though, in 115 BC, he was appointed as a praetor and served in Spain again. More significantly for him and for history, in 113 BC, he returned from Spain, much wealthier, and he now took in marriage a patrician woman by the name of Julia. We know that she was the daughter of an aristocrat by the name of Caius Iulius Caesar, and it is possible that she already had children from a previous marriage, since history also records the name of 2 stepsons that Marius raised. She did, however, also give him a son of his own, who is remembered today by the name Marius the Younger. This woman would be the aunt of the same Iulius Caesar, who would 2 generations later be assassinated, just as he achieved supreme power in Rome. Thus, Marius was the uncle of the man that we remember today as Julius Caesar. The marriage assisted Marius politically, as he now joined his line with that of an aristocratic family. However, the Julian clan had been minimally successful out of all the aristocratic families, and only one member of their bloodline had ever even reached the consulship in the last century. This was the sort of strategic alliance through marriage that can be seen at many points in history. A struggling aristocratic family permits a hardier and perhaps more cunning member of the lower classes to marry into their line and to provide them with some additional boldness and bravery. In 109 BC, Marius was now well into his 40s, and he still had not served the state above the rank of praetor, and the story of his political arc appeared doomed to mediocrity. But something happened now which would finally provide him with an avenue toward real power. In Africa, in the province of Numidia, where the descendants of Massinissa had long been good allies to Rome, trouble began brewing as early as 118 BC. The son of Massinissa died and left the kingdom to 3 heirs. These 3 heirs warred over their possessions. Meanwhile, Jugurtha, the richest and most powerful of the heirs, was known to have bribed many a Roman official. Over the course of the next few years, his wealth would help him to deter Roman interference as he slowly united Numidia under his rule. Roman interference rendered thus useless, Jugurtha seized the last holdout city in Numidia in 111 BC. He massacred not just anyone who might stand in his way as a successor or rebel, he also murdered many Italian colonists who had made Africa their home in the last few decades and who had sided with his enemies. Jugurtha thought that his wealth would buy from the decadent Roman Senate an excuse even for this horror. It nearly did, but the plebs and other commoners of Rome were outraged by the death of these colonists. most of whom had been ambitious fellow commoners that had simply gone forth to seek their fortunes among Rome's conquests, and they were even more enraged by the Senate's slow-footed pace in dealing with this monster in Africa. The Senate sent consuls and their armies to Africa 2 years in a row. The first year, Jugurtha appeared to be tamed. He was called to Rome to answer for his crimes, but he apparently just bribed the Senate again to ignore the charges that they had leveled against him. The second year of the war, in 110 BC, Jugurtha soundly defeated the Roman army sent to Africa to remove him from power. He forced the vanquished consul of that army to sign a treaty recognizing him as the king of all Numidia. Finally, the Senate had had enough. They refused to recognize the treaty, and in 109 BC, they sent another army to take revenge on Jugurtha. The consul in command of that army was a man named Caecilius Metellus, and Marius went as his lieutenant. Remember now, too, that Rome was, for the first time in a very long time, in real mortal peril. Germanic tribes were, at this time, already barging into Gaul, though they had not yet approached Italy. And now the African dominions were threatening another frontier of the Roman Republic's territory. Metellus and Marius chased Jugurtha around his expansive kingdom for 2 years, but failed to capture him and destroy his army. In another unusual development of government, the tribal assembly in Rome forced the Senate to remove Metellus from command, to elect Marius as consul, and to send him to finish the war against Jugurtha. Now, in 107 BC, a truly novus homo, a new man, had been chosen as savior of Roman honor. Over the course of the next 2 years, Marius battled for dominance in Numidia. He defeated the Numidians completely and then invaded Mauritania after Jugurtha fled to that kingdom. Eventually, after negotiations, the Mauritanians turned Jugurtha over to the Romans and signed a treaty, in which Mauritania took over much Numidian territory. In 104 BC, a triumph was celebrated for Marius in Rome. Jugurtha, the captured king, was paraded before the Roman public before being led off to execution. But Marius would have little time to rest from war. By 104 BC, those German barbarians were pillaging Gaul. The Roman Republic was still in mortal danger. And Marius himself was in danger, though he was lauded everywhere as a hero of Rome. As always, though, our greatest enemies are often those closest to us. All through his campaigns in Africa, Marius, now in his 50s, had depended heavily on one of his lieutenants, a younger man by the name of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. This Sulla was a man from the opposite side of the political aisle, a man of aristocratic lineage, though his family was otherwise poor, not possessing the wealth or the fame of many other noble families. And now, as these two different men turned to save Rome from foreign invaders, each of them had distinct plans for his own future and for the future of Rome. The Germans had been raiding Roman territory for years now, and they had defeated multiple Roman armies. What was later known as the Cimbrian War had essentially begun in 113 BC, with the first Germanic invasion of Roman Gaul. But while Marius had been mastering the northlands of Africa, one Roman general after another had failed to stem this barbarian tide. Thus, after celebrating his triumph over Jugurtha and the Numidians in 104 BC, Marius was again elected consul and sent to save Rome from another threat. And he took Sulla with him, of course. It was fortunate for both of these future rulers of Rome that the German tribes had, for the most part, turned away from Italy after their victory at Arausio in 105 BC because the Roman legions were in need of reform and reorganization. So there were 2 years of breathing space now as the Germans ravaged Spain before turning back into Gaul and heading toward Italy. Now, after that terrible battlefield tragedy at Arausio, the common people of Rome felt that these losses were due to poor leadership. They distrusted the aristocratic class to carry on this war properly, so they were glad to put power into the hands of Marius. But older sources tell us that the real problem with the army was the difficulty Rome had in recruiting from an ever-shrinking registry of citizens, since citizenship was tied closely to land ownership, and fewer Romans owned land with every passing year. that the ranks were increasingly filled out with mercenaries and conscripts from subject and allied states. These same ancient sources tell us that Marius, finding the army ill disciplined and poorly manned, reformed the organization and composition of the Roman legions. And if you are familiar with the history of the Peloponnesian War, then you probably have some idea of where this is going. Marius now turned to the proletariat, the least of the plebeian classes, the landless city dwellers. Landed aristocracy were still welcome to join, of course, but Marius greatly increased the representation of the plebs in the army. Now, he did this not by force, but by providing attractive pay, by promising early release from duty for those who volunteered, and by offering land in the conquered territories as a reward when all was finished. Now, be aware that some modern archaeologists, as they are wont to do, have tried to throw cold water on this idea that Marius revolutionized first the army and then the state with this recruitment of the proletariat. They discount this traditional narrative because they do not see the available evidence supporting any kind of significant change in the manning of the legions until later. But this is, after all, the Western Traditions podcast, so I'm sticking with what we have always known and heard about Marius. And now, as the story goes, as the barbarians neared Italy in 102 BC, Marius stood at the head of a new model army. Composed mostly of the proletariat, this reorganized army was fundamentally hostile toward the Senate and the aristocratic class, and its soldiers fought for loot, for compensation and land. This was a revolution without the revolt, because now, if they were victorious, the victors returning to Rome would certainly expect to make society conform to their own goals, and not the goals of those who had stayed home on their landed estates. And victorious they were. Marius led these new legions over the Alps. Once they encountered the Germans marching westward toward Italy, Marius ordered his troops to simply stand and watch as the barbarians filed past the Roman camp. So large was that invading force that it allegedly took 6 days for this army to pass completely by. And then Marius ordered the legions to attack them in the rear. Enemy casualties in the battle remembered as Aquae Sextiae were reportedly over 100,000 killed or captured. But many Germans had gone on into Italy without engaging the legions. So after this victory, the Roman legions under Marius rested for a few months, and then they fought another barbarian horde inside the borders of Italy, near the river Po, and they slew them to the last man. Marius was now hailed as a new Camillus. Camillus, if you remember, was the consul who had saved Rome from the Gauls after they sacked the city in the year 390 BC. Now, Marius had already been elected consul back in 107 BC to finish the war in Africa. During this period, though, from 104 BC to 100 BC, Marius was elected consul every year, 5 times in a row. The grateful Roman people, if not the Senate, were happy to break with tradition and put him back in power for consecutive years. Now, there had been, on very rare occasions, men who had repeated service as consul in Roman history, but no one had ever done this, had endured an executive power for 5 years straight. But there was good reason, many good reasons, for this departure from Roman political custom. The Republic was in constant danger from both external and internal threats. Now, Tiberius Gracchus is the most well-remembered of the men who began to challenge oppression in the Roman state. But even during his tenure, there had been a slave revolt in Sicily, a conflict remembered as the First Servile War. Now again, in the time of Marius, another slave revolt broke out on the island of Sicily. Even as Rome fought for its life against the German invaders in the north, the Second Servile War was started in order to take advantage of the weakened republic. Such is always the way with empires. Athens had experienced the exact same struggle prior to and during the Peloponnesian War. When they were supreme, they were supreme. No one dared to challenge them. But once a crack appeared in the foundations of their power, once their control seemed to waver even a little, once they seemed a little distracted by foreign adventures, there was always an element among the allies and their subject states who were more than ready to throw off the imperial yoke and start slitting throats. Now, early in the Roman expansion, in the 5th and 4th centuries, as Rome incorporated several towns and cities of central Italy, the Roman Senate was quite generous with its citizenship. Newly taken cities, especially if they surrendered or docilely agreed to enter into the Roman embrace, they were offered liberal grants of citizenship and participation in Roman politics. Centuries after Romulus had founded the city, plenty of men who had not been born in the city of Rome proper were registered as citizens and considered themselves thoroughly Roman. But by the time of the Punic Wars and after, the Senate became stingier about doling out its precious grants of citizenship. By the time of the Gracchis, around 130 BC, most Italians were still not Roman citizens, though Rome had indeed begun to identify more closely with their Italian neighbors to distinguish themselves from people in places like Gaul, Hispania, Greece, and Africa. Nevertheless, Italy was still essentially a subject state by the end of the 2nd century BC. Here and there, scattered around, there were certain wealthy men in various cities who possessed Roman citizenship and who could participate in Roman politics, but the vast majority of Italian men were simply subjects of Rome. In fact, there were some small towns quite near Rome in central Italy that had no representation at all in the Senate or in the lower assemblies, which straightforwardly dictated law to the people in these municipalities. We have already heard about the military trouble that this caused for the Republic, when they were forced to conscript troops from such regions who had no reason to believe in Rome or to fight for her, to fight for the state that seemed only to exact taxes from them and give them little to nothing in return. And allied states even farther away were no less disgruntled. When the Cambrian War was underway and Rome was threatened, the Senate sent a mission to the king of Bithynia in Anatolia, requesting help with manpower. The king replied that he no longer had any men of military value because they had all been sold into slavery in order to pay Roman tax collectors. In fact, as the Cambrian War continued and the Roman supply of free men dwindled, the desperate Senate declared that any man who had been enslaved for failure to pay taxes should be freed so that they might conscript these men into the army. This liberation only applied to those who had been enslaved for tax-related reasons, though. It did not by any means free all slaves from their shackles. Now, in a future episode, we will hear about the Third Servile War and the still remembered Spartacus, but at this juncture in Roman history, around the year 103 BC, as the Cambrian War raged on, the Second Servile War erupted. Thousands of slaves in western Sicily rose up and followed their leader, a man named Athenian. Eventually leading some 10,000 fighting men, Athenian defeated numerous Roman armies sent against him over the course of 2 years. After merging with another force of rebel slaves in 101 BC, though, he went forth in 100 BC to meet the army of Manius Acilius. Now, Marius had sent this Manius Acilius, his fellow consul and personal ally, into Sicily with several legions. This consul killed Athenion in single combat, and the slave army was destroyed. Many thousands were captured. Some disarmed slaves were returned to their masters. Others were shipped off to Rome, where Achilles planned for them to fight with wild animals in his triumph before the grateful Roman people. But instead of entertaining their oppressors, the slaves took the knives which they had been given to fight with the wild beasts, and instead they slayed one another until all were dead. Now, over the course of the last century, Roman demographics had changed a little. As they took in more territory and people moved around, mostly from country to city. Yet, as the population changed, the political divide remained quite similar. The names of the factions had changed, but their political platforms were much the same. It was still a matter, in some respects, of rich versus poor, conservative versus liberal. Political dichotomies with which we remain familiar today. Members of the pro-aristocratic faction primarily went by the name of optimates. This Latin term roughly translates into English as the best ones. They stood for Roman tradition, for the aristocracy, obviously, and for the supremacy of the Senate. Their opponents, representing the lower classes, were known as populares, which in Latin just refers to the people. They generally represented those in the lower assemblies. And we have already really seen these groups in action in the drama of the Gracchi brothers, when the people elected tribunes to advance their own agendas, and the Senate tried to suborn these tribunes. But understand that there were really no hard and fast party lines or identification here. These terms, optimates and populares, were likely applied to the factions by Roman historians of the next century, such as Cicero, who looked back on this era and tried to understand the roots of their own political struggles. It's not known if people at the time actually self-identified according to these terms. More importantly for us, we should not try to view this through the lens of the Republican and Democratic parties in the modern United States or the conservative and Labor parties in the UK. Still, though, the terms help us to understand the ancient and perennial struggle between the haves and the have-nots throughout human history. Marius was elected to his sixth term as consul in 100 BC, his fifth consecutive term. Now, since the start of his career, he had represented people of the lower classes, not the proletariat necessarily, but more perhaps those middle classes who were excluded from the senatorial circles, usually due to lack of sufficient wealth and land, and who operated politically through the assemblies and the elections of tribunes. However, he certainly had the moral backing of even the least among the Roman populace. That same fateful year, though, 100 BC, a man named Saturninus was elected to the office of tribune. Now, Saturninus was a real radical. He put forward bills to parcel out conquered lands to war veterans and to lower the price of corn even further to please the masses. Marius approved of all this, but the Senate was appalled by the potential damage that these motions might inflict on the treasury. As happened during the time of the Gracchis, open clashes broke out between the rival political factions. In one struggle, the followers of Saturninus killed a respected member of the aristocracy. The outraged Senate then issued a Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a sort of last resort command to its executives to defend the Roman state. There was no higher law. Marius then, as consul, was bound to obey. He quickly raised a militia and besieged Saturninus and his populares. The surrounded radicals surrendered, and Marius sequestered them in the Senate house to await judgment, but rumors suggest that he did little to stop an angry mob from breaking into the building and lynching every last one of them, including Saturninus. At the end of his sixth term, Marius, his hands soaked in the blood of the radicals he had once championed, retreated into a bitter semi-retirement. But he was not completely done with politics. He would serve a seventh and last time as consul in a future crisis. That crisis would actually be brought on in 86 BC by his old war colleague, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was no radical. Now, from the beginning, he had worked closely with Marius, but he had always leaned aristocratic. And as a consul himself later on, he would work steadily to undo all of Marius's radical agenda. Looking even farther into the Roman future, there was something else auspicious about that year, 100 BC. That year, Marius's brother-in-law, a man by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, became the father of a son to whom he would pass on the same name. And this son, remembered now simply as Julius Caesar, would someday briefly hold supreme power over Rome, before dying under an assassin's knife in 44 BC. We will hear a little more about this Julius Caesar in the next episode, which will focus primarily on the social war, on the murder of the reformer Livius Drusus, and on the virtual dictatorship of Sulla as the Roman Republic continues to destabilize over the next few decades. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.